What's up, WAP? It's Mr. Hill. It's Wednesday night, and we are going to be doing half of this Industrial Revolution lecture because it is lengthy. There's a lot that we have to know about the Industrial Revolution. So let's get right into it. So we talked last lecture about the revolutions that came about, of course, with the Age of Enlightenment, which is in the 18th century or the 1700s. And another thing that occurs in that same 18th century, in fact, right smack dab in the middle of it, 1750, is the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is a huge, huge game changer in world history because it is going to affect not just economics, but also the social classes in industrialized societies. It's going to promote new ideas of how a society should run, create new elites in society, and it's also going to make the industrialized countries very strong and wealthy, and the non-industrialized countries targets of imperialism. Our last theme of this time period is the age of imperialism, which will be in our final unit, which we'll talk about coming up. So the key dates for this time period, the first one here, the Industrial Revolution starts in England in 1750. That's a really nice date to know because you know that is going to have a tremendous amount of impacts, again, economically, politically, socially, all these things. We also see that the Meiji Restoration in Japan, that is a industrial date that we should know because this is when Japan becomes the imperial superpower that it becomes and is a huge player in World War II. All right, so what is industrialization? Industrialization is often thought about as the increased mechanization of production, meaning the increased amount of times in which workers now use machines to do jobs that used to be done by hand. Obviously, that is going to create the factory system that's going to invalidate certain artisans, skilled workers, which has huge, huge effects on society. But also, in part of industrialization are those changes, those effects that occur on society. So industrialization, it encompasses a lot of things. And, going into pre-1750 societies, no matter where you go in the world, you go to East Asia, China, you go to Western Europe, you go to the Americas, anywhere you go around the world, you're going to see people living very much in the same ways. They're going to be farming. Most people in the world at this stage are farmers. Obviously, you're going to have some merchants, you're going to have some artisans, but most of the people are just what we call subsistence farmers, which means that they live off of the land. They're not living necessarily to export or trade anything. They just have, a couple cows, a couple horses, some chickens, some pigs, and they eat what they're off the land. They eat what they have with their land, and then they make what they need. And if they don't have something, they can trade maybe with a neighbor. And that's what our pre-industrialized societies really look like. And this obviously is going to change dramatically with the upsurge of mechanization because now we see high production of goods, consumerism, and where are the jobs? They're in the cities. So we're going to see people moving out of those rural areas and moving into the cities. What are some causes of industrialization? There's lots and lots of causes. One of the early causes is you have these access to all of these raw materials. A good example of this is when the British East India Company was established in India. One of the major exports out of India were finished textiles. The British East India Company starts making Indians produce cotton. So now they have all this cotton. This cotton is coming back into England. At first, our merchants are selling this cotton to women at home in the countryside and say, can you spin this cotton? Can you make it into dresses? They come back, they take those dresses, and then they go and they sell those dresses. And that's something called the cottage industry or the putting out system. They're the same thing. And it's, by today's standards, very, very inefficient. But this was merchants knew that they could make money from selling these dresses, and so they got the cotton from India and they brought them back to England, and they had them produced out in the countryside. Now, obviously, with industrialization, these things are going to change as we see things mass produced in factories. So obviously lots of changes, and we're going to talk a lot about those changes. But first, the causes of the Industrial Revolution. So one of the big causes is population growth, and the population is going to grow for a lot of reasons. Contextually, we know that the Columbian Exchange occurs in 1492 when Columbus sails the ocean blue. And one of the things we always think about the effects on the New World, especially disease like smallpox killing 50 to 90% of the population. But we also know that there are lots of crops, especially highly caloric vegetable crops, that are coming from the New World to the Old World. That is going to cause a huge, huge population spike. And so with an increased population, we have more people that can work in factories. We also have more consumers that can buy goods produced in factories. We have this population growth, and with this population growth, we now need to be able to produce more food. And so we start to see new innovations and technologies that are going to increase the amount of food that can be yielded. One such example is a crop rotation, which we've seen similarly with the three-field system, but a better example is the seed drill. Seed drill is this mechanization right here, and it's a device that does many, many things in the process of farming. It is going to make the hole for the seeds to go in and then efficiently place the seeds as the farmer walks and follows this device, therefore increasing the amount of land that can be cultivated, and thus, of course, increasing the amount of food that can be made. With this, we see more population growth, more people that can work in factories, and more consumers. Of course, the big one is growth of technology. We see lots of technology that starts to invalidate what used to be done by hand, right? We have, for instance, people that were spinners that made woven goods and textiles. Those jobs are largely going to be invalidated by some of these first machines. The spinning jenny, for instance, which was invented by James Hargreaves, this is going to spin 6 threads at the same time, thus being able to do the job of 6 artisans, 6 spinners by one machine. Also, Richard Arkwright has a fantastic addition to mechanization with the water frame, which you can see pictured over here on the screen. The water frame is going to use water power, and so it would be next to a river running water, and then this water power would turn the wheel, and then this would get the mechanization going, and it would power something like the spinning jenny or other spinning machines that would, again, be able to do the jobs that human beings used to do. Because Richard Arkwright invents this water frame, this is the first situation where we see factories springing up along rivers where we can utilize something other than human power to make things. And so this water frame here gives Richard Arkwright the title of the father of the factory system, as we see our first factories lining up along rivers. We also have an American inventor, Eli Whitney, and everybody remembers Eli Whitney as the inventor of the cotton gin because that had such a tremendous impact on American history, especially the American South. But Eli Whitney is also known around the world for another large contribution, and that was championing interchangeable parts. Eli Whitney's an inventor. He gets a job from the American military, the U.S. military, to manufacture rifles. Previously, every single rifle in the American military is made by hand. You have to actually have a skilled artisan there that makes all of the parts of this rifle and then starts on the next one. Now, by doing this, because it is all made by hand, you're out fighting, your rifle gets damaged. You're not able to fix your rifle because every part is unique. You can't just sub in another piece from a different rifle and make it work again. So because of this, Eli Whitney says, is there a way in which that we can make all of the parts exactly the same? And so he starts to use molding, and using molding, producing perfect parts, identical parts, and mass producing these, and then putting them together so that he can mass produce a number of rifles. This idea of interchangeable parts is another integral part of the factory system, because now we have all these different parts of the factory producing these different parts and then putting them together along assembly lines. And so interchangeable parts, Richard Arkwright's water frame, and then we have the idea of division of labor. Let's have these workers that are each specializing in a certain task. We have these identical parts. So one person is going to use one part, the next person is going to use the next part, assemble them. If you're making, for instance, cars with Henry Ford, one person puts on the wheels, the next person puts on the steering wheel, what have you. So the division of labor is the idea of each worker specializing in a specific task. Now, Henry Ford is very, very famous for his Model T cars and his production of automobiles, the first mass-produced automobiles, especially out of Detroit, the start of the 20th century, so the early 1900s. And he wasn't the one that pioneered the assembly line. We saw the assembly line, in fact, about 100 years previous, being used in factories. But he was the first one to pioneer the moving assembly line. And that means that the products are actually on a conveyor belt. They're actually moving in front of you, and the worker stays in one place and just does their job in division of labor as the products move towards them along the assembly line. Then new changes, the steam engine. The steam engine is produced by James Watt, and the steam engine uses coal, which obviously is a fossil fuel, to create energy. This is going to allow factories to not necessarily have to be located right next to a water source, a river. Now you don't have to use Richard Arkwright's water frame. Now you can use steam to power machines. And so this again is going to lead to more production in factories. And then of course you have the steamship, and the steamship is obviously used in transportation, but the steamship has huge additions to the factory system as well, because obviously, one, you can produce goods quicker and then transport goods quicker to wherever it is that you're selling your goods. You also can move raw materials into your factories quicker. But then the other thing is you double the amount of potential consumers that you can trade to. For instance, if you're in the United States and you're a producer of textiles, let's say you're up in New England, and then you sail down the Ohio River to come in and trade with as many people as possible. Before the steamship, you have to sell your goods only down that river. You're going down that river, you're trading with people along the way, you're selling your goods along the way. But once you get to the bottom of that river, you're going to have to either, one, tow that ship all the way back up the river, or disassemble it and then take it up with horses. Now you have the steamship. Now the steamship is going to turn around and steam power right back up that river and do it again. So thus you have doubled your possible consumers, because you have obviously more people to be able to trade to. So, and you can do it quicker, which is great. With the steamship, we see the creation of coaling stations, and coaling stations become a major part of trade routes and international trade, because as steamships became the most used ship in the era, obviously they had to refuel in places, and so they're going to be located in places along major trade routes. For instance, as you go through the Europe to the Indian Ocean, as we saw many Europeans, especially the British in India or the Dutch in the Dutch East Indies, if you're steaming around the Cape of Good Hope, you're going to stop in Cape Town, where there's natural coal deposits, and you can refuel on coal so that you can make your way through the Indian Ocean. Obviously, the same is true coming into some of the islands in the Caribbean that became coal stations because they were easiest to stop through on the way to the United States, North America, or of course any of the Americas. Also, coal, because it burns so hot, creates the production of iron. Iron was very strong, but if it wasn't built in the right way, it would break. It was very brittle. And so Henry Cort is an inventor. He patents the process of making iron more malleable, more easier to use. And so iron is going to create a new sort of industrial revolution in infrastructure. And of course, it is going to be the metal used most in railroads. Railroads, another huge part of the Industrial Revolution, is it allows, again, more and more consumers to be reached with production. Another part of the Industrial Revolution that is all tied into mechanization is urbanization. Urbanization is the growth of cities. We see people move to the cities, especially to be located because that's where the factories are located. If you are a very poor farmer, and you are struggling to make ends meet, and you say, you know what, the jobs are in the cities, that's where the factories are, you're going to move to the cities and get a job where you can. The same is true in England, except there's a unique situation in England that's going to cause many people to move to the cities before anywhere else, and that's the enclosure movement. The enclosure movement was a situation that previous to this movement, poor farmers were allowed to cultivate public lands called the commons. And farmers would cultivate this land. They would tend their sheep on this land. They would obviously, take their crops and then sell them in the local markets to make a profit. Well, eventually the government says we shouldn't have this land be free to everybody. We should close off this land and then tax people to use this land. And that's exactly what they did. They literally enclosed the land. This is called the enclosure movement. Now, some farmers were able to afford this tax on using this land. Some were not. If you were a poor farmer and you were barely making lands meet already, you can't afford to pay this tax. And so what are you going to do? You're going to stop being a farmer. You're going to move to the cities to work in the factories. And so either way, factories in these cities are going to bring people out of the rural countryside and into the urban areas. That's what urbanization is. Because it starts in England first, these people are going to be moving into urban areas like Manchester and Liverpool. All right. So why does Britain industrialize first? We have some environmental reasons, and then we have some non-environmental reasons. Let's start with the really, really obvious stuff, the Atlantic Ocean. Britain is an island. It's located on the Atlantic Ocean, and this makes it very, very easy to export and import goods to a number of different production areas. You look at Liverpool right here. Your ship can come through the Atlantic and it can land right into the harbor here and export lots of goods. You can bring cotton from India or the American South, and you can bring them right into the textile mills there. So perfect. For that same reason, you also have lots of rivers so that you can afford to have industrial areas in the middle of the islands, as you can take rivers and bring those goods right over there to, say, Birmingham here and be able to trade from there. So rivers, just for the same reason as the Atlantic Ocean, makes it very easy to transport materials. And then coal. That's a big one because we have Britain is rich in fossil fuel coal. This is going to allow lots of energy to be produced that are going to fuel these factories and be able to produce lots of goods. So geographically, Atlantic Ocean, rivers, and coal. Other reasons, Britain was very, very busy in the first era of colonization. It created a lot of colonies. By having colonies, it leads to more industrialization because Britain has access to lots of capital, lots of wealth that can produce more wealth. For instance, Britain controls the eastern colonies over here, which becomes the United States. Lots of goods are coming from there over to Great Britain. You've got lumber from New England area. You've got tobacco. You've got cotton from the South. From India, you've got cotton coming in. All of these things are going to go right into factories that are going to produce lots of wealth. And so you need raw materials to produce manufactured goods. Where are you getting those raw materials from? The colonies. That's what makes Britain, again, a huge advantage in industrializing first. Britain also has the strongest fleet of ships in the world, the strongest navy in the world. This is going to protect their merchants that are going to go in and trade overseas. It's also going to allow them to trade a lot because they have lots of ships that are able to come in and bring lots of wealth. Their government also is advanced. It's democratic. It protects private property. We saw our first joint stock companies emerging out of England with the British East India Company or the London Company. These were joint stock companies with limited liability. This is going to cause investors to want to invest, to feel safe to invest. And that, of course, is going to lead to industrialization. France and Germany are going to industrialize. They're going to become some of our Western powers. When we talk about industrialization, we start to talk about the countries that become the most dominant countries in the world. And those are the countries that industrialize. England is certainly one of those. France and Germany become those, although they industrialize far behind England. And then another one, of course, is the United States of America. And then to a lesser extent, the Dutch as well. France and Germany, they do industrialize, but they have reasons why they industrialize slower than, say, Great Britain or the United States. France obviously has a French Revolution going on. They are go through this bloody revolution, and then Napoleon seizes power, and he rules until 1815. And so it slows them down in focusing on business, and thus, obviously, they're going to be a little bit slower in industrializing. And then Germany also went through wars of unification with Otto von Bismarck and their wars to unite Prussia into one unified Germany. But once they were unified, finally in 1871, they became an industrialized country very, very quickly, a leading producer of steel and coal. I think this graph is quite telling. When you look at 1870 here and you look at the highest producing country in the world, that is the United Kingdom. But then, however, by the time you get to 1913, the year before World War I, it is the United States of America. Germany has come in and passed the UK, but France is coming in, and then Russia after that. The United States. How does the United States come from a very new country, becoming a new country officially in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence? How does it become the strongest manufacturing nation in the world in only 100 years? It's amazing how it is able to do that. And the United States is just lucky that it has a very unique set of circumstances that allows this to occur. The United States is going to start industrialize, obviously, after Great Britain. Great Britain's going to go first. The mechanization, the machines of Britain are going to make their way over to the United States roughly around 1812. When this occurs, the United States is quickly going to become the most powerful manufacturing nation in the world. One of the biggest reasons why is the United States government is going to sponsor railroads and canals. They are going to give subsidies for railroads and canals. What that means is the United States government wants money. They want lots of business going down in their country because they're able to tax that business and they're able to make money and their country is able to be successful. So they understand, the US government understands that railroads and canals help business. If you build railroads throughout the country, connecting one side of the country to the other, now you can have manufacturers on either side of the country produce as many goods as they want because they can sell their goods throughout the country. Thus, more goods are going to be sold and the United States is going to make more wealth. The same is true of canals. Canals are essentially man-made rivers that allow ships to travel in places they couldn't before. For the same reason, the US is going to give subsidies to have these things built. Subsidies are money that they give to private companies to build these things. And one of the biggest examples of this, a nice proper noun for you guys, is the Transcontinental Railroad. Transcontinental Railroad is built by two private companies that received subsidies from the United States, meaning the US government paid those companies to build this railroad so that we could have a connected United States and therefore businesses can flourish. So one of the reasons why the United States industrialized so quickly is because the US government took action to do so, which is not going to be the case in most of the countries around the world. So that you do have to give the US government some credit in industrialization. But there are two elements of American industrialization that don't include the American government, one of which is natural resources. The United States, because it is such a brand new country, I mean, if you look at the rest of the world, in the Eastern Hemisphere, it has been populated and had people living there for literally thousands of years. Well, obviously, the United States, much, much less densely populated. Native Americans, very, very little impact on the environment, and therefore we have tons of raw materials, natural resources. We've got lumber, we've got coal, we've got oil, all of these things available untouched and therefore at the business's disposal. And then the other thing is really high levels of immigration, tons and tons of immigrants coming in from both sides of the country. On the East Coast, we see lots of Irish, lots of Germans, lots of Italians coming in. Largely, if you're going to immigrate to the New World, it's because you don't have a lot of land, you don't have a lot of money in the old worlds, or you're coming for some sort of religious persecution. Whatever the case is, if you're going to give up and start it over in a new country, it's largely because you're looking for land or opportunity. Those immigrants coming to the United States on the East Coast are poor. they're poor, and they come on in to places like New York, and businesses there are going to say, we've got a job for you. We've got a place for you to live. Come on in and work in our factories. And because of this, we've got a lot of workers willing to take very, very low wages, work very, very long hours. And that, of course, is going to increase production. The same is true on the West Coast. We've got immigrants coming in from places like China, especially, and to a lesser extent, Japan, also taking very, very low wages. Okay, so we see historians break down industrial revolution into two industrial revolutions. The first industrial revolution is pre-electricity, pre-internal combustion engine, and pre-steel. So our main inventions in the first industrial revolution are things like the steam engine that are powering steamboats. You have things like the water frame that is using water power in factories, all these things. That is going to use water and steam, obviously, to power factories. The second industrial revolution that occurs roughly around 1860 is where you're going to see the production of steel, chemicals, electronics, and machinery. And now you have electricity, and that really truly is going to create a huge abundance of machines and mechanization, because now obviously you can power machines by electricity. This is the most efficient way of doing things, and it's going to allow huge amounts of production. Another thing, when we talk about transportation, that is helping industrialization, because you're able to sell goods quicker than ever before and to more people. That is where the internal combustion engine comes in. Now we have automobiles, now we have airplanes, and they're coming in literally at the exact same time. And so, with these things, obviously, not only are you using them for transportation, you're also producing them and selling them, and that's coming into the environment as well. That's coming into the economy. The telephone, the radio, now this is revolutionizing ordering goods. You can call on the telephone and place an order. And of course, the radio, that brings in the dawn of advertising. Now you can come in and advertise your goods. So lots of new inventions. It's only going to increase production and mechanization. Steel and oil, two of the biggest goods that are produced in the Industrial Revolution. For steel, there's a new process. Mass production of steel became possible with the Bessemer process. It has to do with blasting molten metal with air that makes a stronger metal than iron. And what we start to see, the railroad moguls, the really, really rich millionaires that are birthed out of the Industrial Revolution, the people that make a fortune off of owning factories and producing things. Many of them are going to make lots of money in the railroad industry because they're going to use steel on their railroads while everyone else is using iron, and they can make a safer product, a smoother product, which is going to get them lots of business. So steel becomes the backbone of industrial society, both laying railroad, and we see thousands and thousands of miles of track laid in railroad, and also just infrastructure in general, bridges, buildings, all of these things. Of course, petroleum becomes one of the most coveted resources in the world after the creation of automobiles and airplanes. Previously, actually, petroleum, is funny enough, was used mostly for extracting kerosene, and kerosene was used in lanterns. You would light it, and it would provide light for you. Obviously, with electricity, we don't see kerosene as that important anymore. And after we saw electricity, you were looking at oil, like, okay, well, this might be a dying industry. And then, of course, with the creation of automobiles and planes, now you have gasoline that becomes a coveted extract of petroleum. And so the oil industry becomes huge, and we start to see commercial oil wells, people that own oil wells that control oil and then are able to sell and distribute that oil. And that's where J.D. Rockefeller gets his millions, from the production and distribution of oil. Two inventors, Alexander Graham Bell with the telephone, and then Guglielmo Marconi with the radio. Both of these things, again, key in communication, so that you can advertise and then place your orders ahead. Russia. Now, Russia, as we know, very behind when compared to the rest of Europe. Russia obviously is a very, very large country. But most of the country is very, very cold, and it's very difficult to live. It's very difficult to produce much of anything or gather large cities in areas where it's so cold. And because of this, Russia has been behind the rest of Europe for most of its history. When you talk about Russia, it was especially delayed because of Batu Khan and the Mongols that came in and stopped Russia from going through the Renaissance. Because of this, they had feudalism for so much longer than the rest of Europe. And because of this, they still had a very old school government. I mean, when you look at the revolutions that are going on throughout Europe, where we start to see democracies and parliament governments, Russia is still controlled by a czar. The czar gets to make all the decisions. And we don't see a lot of things that the United States is doing, for instance, where it's giving subsidies for railroads and canals and helping businesses. We don't see the same thing in Russia, with the exception of railroads. Russia is always constantly looking for ways to trade with Asia. It has St. Petersburg, the one warm water port, so that it's able to go in and trade with Western Europe, but it doesn't have a way to go over and trade with Asia, as it's been looking for to be able to do for a long, long time. And that's where the Trans-Siberian Railroad comes in. This is this hugely, hugely long railroad that connects Moscow all the way over to the Pacific Ocean. And this is going to allow Russia to start to emerge as a more powerful country in the world, because it has access to all these coveted Asian goods. And in fact, steel especially becomes the biggest good that it produces, which makes sense given that if you're focusing on railroads, you make the railroads out of steel. And I kept this slide in here, and I went over this in class. I want to point this out. This is during World War II, so obviously we're out of the time frame. But I want to point to how manufacturing and producing directly leads to military success, because this is some of the things that students get a little bit confused with. Why do industrial nations become so much more powerful than the rest of the world? Part of it is, if you have so much wealth, you can pay larger armies. You can use that wealth to buy foodstuffs at times of war, to buy weapons from other countries, all these things. So part of it is wealth. But the other part of it is that you are able to produce far more weapons of war than any other country. And the United States in World War II is the best example of this. If we look in 1942, the Japanese, after sinking 8 heavy ships of the United States at the attack at Pearl Harbor, have more aircraft carriers than the United States. They're sitting with 14. The United States has 10 in 1942. By the time we get 3 years later, the United States has 45 compared to 5. And it is manufacturing that is going to win the war for the United States, just simply able to produce more than any other country, and having more weapons of war is the difference. And this plot over here, this graph, you can look at airplanes, and yeah, the United States is this country that is absolutely dominating production, and therefore the most powerful nation in World War II. So manufacturing, production, it does lead to military might as well. Okay, a hugely important concept is capitalism. Capitalism existed in a very small fashion previous to this time period, 1450 to 1750, but capitalism starts to emerge as we start to see people have more wealth. Industrial societies have more and more wealth that are coming into them, because we have all of these raw materials coming into the country. We have all this gold and silver. We have now these available jobs in the cities, and we see the government that's helping business, and we see some people get fabulously, fabulously wealthy. Now, these people now have so much wealth that they start to buy things that previously no one ever controlled. They started to buy the raw materials of the country. We saw people owning the oil in the United States. We saw people owning gold mines and silver mines, owning huge, large businesses and corporations. This has never existed before, right? This is new, where people own large amounts of lands and the means of production, the means to produce wealth. That is what capitalism is. And in a time where the government is trying to help business and not try to help the worker, we see that capitalism is going to make some people fabulously wealthy, but others are going to have absolutely no rights, and those are the workers that are working for the people that own the means of production. And so that's what capitalism is. Capitalism, economic and political system where a country's businesses are controlled by private owners for profit rather than by the state. So if you went over to, Russia, for example, most of the land is owned by the czar. Most of the property is owned by the czar. So that is state-controlled business, state-controlled means of production. Come to the United States, and businesses, people own those things, right? And so that's our difference between capitalism and state-controlled businesses. So a person with a means of production can make a lot of personal wealth in that, right? And that's that American dream where you can start from nothing, you can strike it rich in a business, and you can make lots of money. You can own the machines, you can own the factories, the mines, the land, whatever it is. If you control those examples of means of production, you can make lots of wealth. But what capitalism also does is it leads to a sharp divide in the social classes. We have the person that own the means of production making lots of money, and then we have the workers that are making not so much money. And so it widens the gap between the rich and the poor. So that's what capitalism does. And Adam Smith was a big advocate of capitalism in The Wealth of Nations. The Wealth of Nations was his book in which he advocated for laissez-faire capitalism. He didn't want the government interacting with the economy at all. He wanted people to be able to make as much wealth as possible, to be able to produce what they wanted when they wanted. He especially didn't like mercantilism. He didn't like the government saying, you need to ship your things here, you need to ship your things there. That's government-controlled trade. He says, no, people should control trade. People should control business, etc. And laissez-faire, as he is promoting, laissez-faire is the most extreme form of capitalism. And what I mean by that is if the government, laissez-faire means leave alone. The government isn't touching the economy at all. And if that happens, the government doesn't do anything, doesn't pass any laws regulating business, that means you're going to see some people that are going to start to control more and more of the country's wealth. This is where the richest people in world history ever existed because there were no rules or regulations. There were no regulations on creating a monopoly on all of the goods of a certain good or service in a country. There were no rules on how much you had to pay your workers. And so workers were being paid less to nothing while the business owners made all of the wealth. And so Adam Smith, when he wrote this, The Wealth of Nations, in 1776, he was promoting free business, but he never knew to the extent of what industrialization was going to do. He never knew when he wrote this book that, in fact, there could be such fabulous wealth created by laissez-faire government. And laissez-faire government is going to create problems. There's going to be problems that are created by all of these people that are fabulously wealthy, and then a large group of poor people that are working for those people that don't have any rights or wealth. And so we do see with laissez-faire government lots of giant corporations that are owned by stockholders who are investors, individuals who buy stock or share of a company, and then get part of the dividends of that company. They get part of the wealth from those the companies. And with these massive corporations that start to emerge, where we have all these wealthy investors that are investing in more and more property and more control over certain goods, we see monopolies in which one big corporation has control over an entire market. When you look at Alfred Krupp in Germany, he controlled all of the steel production all throughout the country. J.D. Rockefeller, it was oil. He would produce all of the country's oil, and in fact, 90% of the world oil. So these people were fabulously wealthy by creating these multinational corporations owned by lots of stockholders. But of course, these two men, Alfred Krupp and J.D. Rockefeller, controlling the majority stock in their companies and therefore seeing the lion's share of wealth. Transnational companies, a little different in that it's exactly what it sounds like. Transnational means it's multiple nations, and we start to see these emerge. And one of the pioneers of this was Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes was a social Darwinist. He was a racist, and he believed that Anglo-Saxons were the most evolved society, the most evolved civilization. And he believed that was going to create a railroad from the southern tip of Africa all the way up to the northern tip, and he was going to use cheap African labor to build it. And so he pays native Africans very, very low wages to build his railroad. And it actually was never created because Britain didn't even control all of the land that was in the proposed route that he was going to build this railroad. But by how inexpensively he built this railroad, this was kind of the blueprint for other corporations to start moving outside of their home countries to exploit low wages, cheap labor in other parts of the world. Big business also becomes a huge part of politics because corporations are going to become so fabulously wealthy that they're going to use their wealth to come in and influence politics. One of the big ways that this happens is if someone's running for senator or president or whatever the case is, big business can say, we'll donate a huge amount to your campaign, but when you are elected, you need to not pass laws that are going to make it so we have to pay our workers minimum wage, for instance, or if you're a steel mogul or an oil mogul, for instance, you will donate money to your campaign, but you have to promise to allow us to continue to drill oil in these, wildlife preserves that some leaders might not let us drill oil there, right? So businesses start to use their money to influence politics. Another way would be businesses working with local leaders where they would say, okay, don't raise taxes in this area so that we can continue to make a large profit, but we'll build a factory in your community so that lots of jobs come to your community. So businesses using their wealth to influence politics. But we also see a big part of industrialization is social change. How are people affected by the Industrial Revolution? In general, countries that industrialized saw more wealth. You see, in general, lots of money being made, and then that money is going to trickle down society, at least in some ways, to make it into the middle class and the lower classes. And in fact, middle class workers benefited from industrialization as well. Now, the middle class in Europe, who are those people going to be? Those are going to be not necessarily the massive business owners, but they'll be people like managers. They'll be skilled workers that are educated, that are going to be able to look over a certain factory, to be able to look over a certain shop or business. And then, of course, we have the workers in the factories that are going to be our lowest elements of society. But in general, in countries that industrialize, we're going to see more wealth, and we're going to see more money in the hands of the middle class and, of course, the upper class. Now, the urban poor, of course, are living in very, very poor conditions. They're mistreated. Young children are working in factories. We have child labor. Women are working in sweatshops, textile industries. They're spending less time at home, really long hours. The most average workday in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution was 14-hour days, 6 days a week, which is obviously really, really bad. Middle-class women, if they could afford it, wouldn't work. They would stay home. And so it became this sign of privilege if you didn't have to work as a woman, because you could say, oh, my husband is paying for our whole family. I don't have to work in the factories. This is a privilege that I have. It was a sign of status. Unfortunately, this has a negative effect on society as we start to see something emerge called the cult of domesticity, which I believe we have a slide coming up to talk about that. So effects of industrialization on the middle class. Like I said, we see industrialization is going to lead to increased living standards for the middle class. They have access to goods, housing, education. Because of this, the middle class children oftentimes had access to better jobs than, for instance, our low-wage immigrants that were coming over not speaking English or very poorly educated, and so the only jobs that they could take were the factory jobs. And so wealth and opportunities is going to bring our middle class into cities, but they're going to live in segregated areas of society. For instance, New York becomes one of the most overpopulated places in the world. By 1900, we're looking at 3 million people in New York. But there's nice areas in New York where the middle class lives, and they're nice suburban homes. And then we have the slums where the lower class workers live, and they were cramped into areas with poor sanitation and poor health codes, all these things. So class structure, what does industrialization do to class structure? We really see emerging three classes. The people up at the very top of our captains of industry. These are the richest of the rich, the millionaires. Really, this era is where we see our first millionaires. And these are our owners of our large corporations. Andrew Carnegie made his money in steel. Cornelius Vanderbilt up there in railroads. J.P. Morgan was a banker. Thomas Edison was an inventor of lots of things, but obviously the light bulb and harnessing electricity. Henry Ford, obviously in the automobile industry. And so those are our captains of industry, the people that have millions and millions. White collar workers are our middle class. There are factory and office managers. There are small business owners. These are the people that are making more wealth in an industrialized society, but still not obviously as much as the captains of industry. And then our working class, the factory workers, the coal miners, the people that are working the really poor jobs in society. In general, how does life change with industrialization? Before industrialization, families, they're working close together. They're largely spending a tremendous of time around their local area. They're working on the farm or the local market. The women are staying home, but they're spinning fabric for the family. Children are staying home with the mother, or when they get old enough, working out with the father out on the farm. After industrialization, we're going to see a lot less family time. We're going to see parents having to leave their children to work in the factories unless their children had to come in and work as well. Got those long work days, 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, and very dangerous work in factories. With the absence of health codes, we could see, especially those long hours, you lose concentration for a second. You could lose a finger, an arm, a limb. So really, really dangerous conditions. On women specifically, industrialization is going to affect women depending on their class. If you are a working class woman, you would work in just the same as the men in some really poor areas of society, the coal mines, the factories, and especially textile factories became what was considered women's work at the time. And sometimes factory owners actually preferred to hire women because they could pay women less. In fact, most of the time, about half as much as men, arguing that because men were supposed to be the sole breadwinners of the home, that they didn't have to pay women as much, that this was just discretionary income at that point. Obviously sexist, but they got away with it in the time period. And then our middle class women, again, did not have to work in factories, and this was a sign of privilege. This just said we didn't have to go out and work. Our husband makes enough money, and this was considered a good thing at the time. But the negative impact of this was the emergence of the cult of domesticity. Cult of domesticity is the idea that being a housewife is a status symbol. This is a sign of class, and because of this, it was almost like it was an aspiring thing. You would aspire to do this. And of course, some women love to be housewives, and that was their aspirations, but it became the aspiration for all women, or at least society said that it should be the aspiration for all women. And we saw advertising and consumer culture would contribute to this, because women were supposed to be in charge of buying household products for home and taking care of the children at home and raising them to be polite. And this obviously, for many, left women in a very restricted life. Industrialization, because of this, because of the restrictions of housewifery, it spurred feminism, and so did the Enlightenment. And so both of these things, industrialization and the Enlightenment, happened at the same time. And so we do see a rise in feminism at this time. For instance, we talked about this last lecture, but the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 in New York, which is our first women's movement, fighting for better rights, including suffrage for women. Consumerism is because we have the mass production of goods now. We are now seeing businesses looking to sell those goods in mass quantities, and culture of the mini industrialized society is constantly looking to buy these manufactured goods. It's constantly looking for what's new, what's next. That's what consumerism is all about. And because we have this mass production of goods, part of consumerism is also advertising. Businesses start to advertise to the people that can afford um, products like this, and so especially the middle class and the upper class that can afford goods to spend their disposable income on their income that doesn't have to be used on food and shelter. Leisure activities, because more people are working longer hours, leisure activities become more important. If you have that day off of your 14-hour day, 6 days a week, you're going to want to spend that one day off in a leisure activity. And so these activities become more popular and also more commercialized. We see goods to be sold for leisure activities. First, we had the penny farthing bike, which is up there, which just looked at it and said, this doesn't seem to make any sense. And then what we would now know is the bicycle, now at the time called the safety bicycle, which was our typical bicycle that we think about today. So that's a good that was sold in mass quantities for leisure activities. And then, of course, professional sports. Soccer in Europe became very popular. Baseball in the United States. Sometimes if you had access to wealth, you had access to different sports. If you didn't have access to wealth, you played a different sport. For instance, in England, if you had money, then you could play tennis or golf, which required lots of balls and a racket. Or if you were lower classes, you would play rugby, which only requires one ball amongst the whole team. So it required less wealth to play and practice. Public culture emerges as a result of this. 1850 to 1900, we start to see people, businesses start to build music halls, public parks, sports stadiums, commercializing public culture. All of this comes out of the Industrial Revolution, and it was anyone that could afford a ticket. And the thought process with some businesses and societies where we would see all of the cultures, all of the classes, the upper classes, the lower classes coming together, and the lower classes who didn't have access to education would get to see how the upper classes behaved and learn from them and emulate them. And so this was kind of a social experiment, if you will, to bring society into more controlled atmosphere. All right. So with industrialization, we see the need for reform. Why do we see the need for reform with industrialization? Because workers have no rights. They're working in dangerous and unsanitary working conditions. They're working for low wages, long hours. They have no health insurance. There's no workers' compensation if they get hurt on the job. We see children working. And largely, all of these things exist for years, 50 years. We see child labor. In some places, 100 years, we see child labor with no changes. In Britain, which is obviously our first country to industrialize, we have a stimulus for change, and that's the Sadler Report. Sadler Report was a study released by the British Parliament that described the terrible, terrible conditions that we saw workers working in, and thus it made the middle class more aware of how bad factory life is, and the middle class is going to advocate for change. Classical liberalism. So classical liberalism is, we see all of this is our age of isms. We see lots of different social systems, many theories that are promoted on how to deal with the problems created by industrialization. Classical liberalism is founded in individual liberties to protect the individual. Conservatism is founded on not a lot of changes, and the people that are currently in power stay in power. So classical liberalism then is going to be advocating for natural rights. We want limitations on the government. We don't want the government to be too strong so they don't infringe upon natural rights. And then as industrialization starts to occur, we want individual protections for workers. We want things that are going to help workers in the workplace. We also want to be able to advocate for ourselves. So one of the things that classic liberals are going to advocate for is suffrage, the right to vote. In many places, still property requirements made people not able to vote. You needed to own a certain amount of property. Even the United States, up until the 1820s, not all white males were allowed to vote. because of property requirements. And so with this, universal manhood suffrage is one of the things that many liberals, classic liberals, are going to advocate for because it gave more powers to the common person. One advocate for social change is John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill advocated for utilitarianism. Utilitarianism says that if it is good for the most amount of people, then it should be done. And because of this, this is going to advocate for change for labor unions, child labor laws, all of these things, because obviously it's not good for the business owner that is going to lose money and wealth, but it is good for the greatest amount of people. And so John Stuart Mill, advocating for utilitarianism, is going to help create the first labor unions. At first, labor unions were considered illegal. Governments looked at labor unions as rebellions. They looked at the workers as trying to stop business and stop wealth from being created. And that was looked on as bad by governments because governments wanted wealth to be created because they could tax more people and gain more money. But labor unions needed to be created because of how poorly the workers were treated and how badly workers, how long their days were, 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, unhealthy conditions. You guys know it. For most of the 19th century, they were illegal in Britain and the United States. But when we get to the 20th century, and guys, we should know our centuries, right? When I say 20th century, that's our 1900s. When we get to our 20th century, the 1900s, labor unions start to win some important battles. Minimum wage, overtime, limits on working hours, and a 5-day work week. So labor unions, a big agent in social reform and change to help the lower classes. We also see social reform in Britain, and we have some proper nouns we could use. In 1843, children under the age of 10 not allowed to work in coal mines. That's pretty common sense. 1881, children must go to school. Between ages 5 to 10, they need at least an elementary education. Otto von Bismarck of Britain, Germany, first Prussia, then Germany, is going to be an advocate for workers' rights, social reform. He's going to advocate for accident compensation, unemployment insurance. Why does he do this? Why is he advocating for this? He's advocating because he's afraid that if I don't give the workers some rights, that the workers are going to turn to socialism. And of course, the most extreme form of socialism is communism. Speaking of socialism, and we're almost done with the lecture, guys, socialism is a theory that there should be an egalitarian distribution of wealth. Socialism is in many ways the opposite of capitalism. Capitalism is the idea that if you own the means of production, you can make almost unlimited forms of wealth, and why some people might make a lot of money, some people might make very, very little money, the workers. Socialism changes that. Socialism says we should distribute the wealth more equally throughout the population. Now, socialism, there are elements of socialism in the United States, which is a very capitalist society. For instance, universal health care is a socialist idea because it's taking taxes from people, especially more so the rich, and then is using that money to provide healthcare for people that can't afford it. That's socialism. It's egalitarian distribution of wealth. Public schools, the same way. We're taxing the people, then we're providing education to people that can't afford it or didn't have access to it before. However, socialism in some ways can be very moderate, like those examples, or extreme socialism is where you divide all of the wealth up equally amongst everyone. And to do that, the state controls everything. And that, of course, would be communism. And communism is the most extreme form of socialism, just as laissez-faire is the most extreme form of capitalism. As societies go into some really drastic changes with industrialization, as people become very, very poor, working in factories, etc., we see some people that just try to escape from industrialized society and try to go and form utopias. Utopias are like perfect societies out in nature, especially, where we're going to go live and we're going to have a perfect society where everybody's equal. Those are our utopian socialist societies. And we see actually 40 or 50 of them in this era, some of them in the United States. And they were inspired by this guy, Charles Fourier. This guy was a French social theorist. He was theorizing that you could have a perfect society if individuals constantly shifted jobs. There's 810 jobs in the society. Every year you switch your job. One time you're a lawyer, the next year you're a farmer, the next year you're a business owner, whatever the case is. And because of this, you get paid for those different jobs, and you get paid differently for those different jobs. But because you're constantly shifting, everyone is making more or less the same amount of money. He thought that this would not have a class struggle. The poor people or the lower class are going to be frustrated at the upper class all the time, and the upper class is always fearing rebellion from the lower class. That's something that occurs in capitalism. Charles Fourier says if you shift jobs all the time, you won't have that class struggle. Now, this concept of class struggle is embraced by our most famous social theorist and economic theorist of the era, which is Karl Marx. Karl Marx writes the Communist Manifesto, which becomes the mantra, the manifesto of communism. The idea behind this extreme socialism in which the problems of capitalism, the class struggle, is theoretically resolved. Marx writes that there are two classes in society, just two. One is the proletariat, which is the working class, the poor. The other is the bourgeoisie, which is the middle class who own the factories and the machinery. Not to be confused with bourgeoisie in France, which was the third estate. I know that's a little confusing. Karl Marx says the bourgeoisie, the middle class, they own the means of production. And because they own the means of production, they're going to constantly keep the proletariat shackled in that they don't have wealth, they don't have political power. And he said, this is the class struggle. And the class struggle must be fixed by the proletariat, the working class, rising up and seizing control of the means of production. He says the proletariat does all the hard work. They do the physical work, they do the dangerous work, but they don't receive any of the wealth that they're producing. And so he calls upon the workers of the world to unite. That's the most famous line from the Communist Manifesto. Workers of the world, unite, rise up, take control of the means of production, and then distribute the wealth evenly amongst the people. This idea was called communism. And of course, it is going to influence many communist revolutions throughout history. The most famous is the Russian Revolution that occurs in 1917. Urbanization, we have some problems with urbanization that need to be fixed. And one such example is the slums. People that are the poor, we know that our cities were very segregated. The middle class lived in the nice kind of suburban areas of the cities, and then the poor were crammed together in some really, really bad areas of the city with poor sanitation, overcrowding. Working class families would often be crowded into tenement apartments. These were especially popular in places like New York, where we saw immigrants arriving by the hundreds or the thousands, depending on the year, every day. And so they would be crammed into these tenement apartments where they would share 6-7 people to a room. And oftentimes these apartments would be owned by the factory owners themselves. The factory owners would say, I'll provide you a place to live. You got to come in and work every morning until night, and then come in and live in this place. And they would collect rent from them as well. So controlled literally all aspects of these workers' lives. These would be located in the urban slums, the poorest areas of society. And the biggest problems with the slums is that they were so crowded that the governments had not yet adapted to so many people living in one place. People out in the farms, if they were living in the farms, they would be able to dispose of their goods pretty quickly. In fact, if you were living out on farms, you probably didn't have a lot of trash. Things didn't come in containers on farms. Your food would come directly from the land. You would eat that. If you had some trash, you would throw it to the pigs. This has changed with urbanization and mechanization and production and consumerism. Everything comes in a throwaway bottle, a box, a bag, a can. All of these things are being consumed, and then they become trash. Well, who's going to pick it up? Well, of course, cities had to come up with sanitation bureaucracies to be able to pick this stuff up. But because there's so many people moving into these cities so quickly, municipal governments, being the city government, they can't handle all this stuff. There's so much waste all the time. They're not able to manage these big cities. Also with overcrowding, you have problems like fires. You have so many people living in one place. You can't get out of buildings if there's a fire. You see some terrible accidents. And so municipal governments have to respond. They're going to adapt. They're going to create bureaucracies to control the problems of city life. They're going to create police departments and fire departments, and they're going to pass laws that are going to make things safer. We need to have standards in buildings so that there's fire escapes for each 10 amount of people. There should be a fire escape, whatever the case is. So cleaner water, etc. Our last 4 slides here, environmental effects of industrialization. Obviously, when you're burning fossil fuels, you are going to create effects on the environment. Coal and petroleum, both fossil fuels. And so by burning these things for energy, we are going to see toxic air pollution. We're also going to see toxic waste dumped into rivers and streams and lakes. This is going to cause disease, especially to areas where so many factories are prevalent in the slums. That is going to have effects, again, on the poorer aspects of society. Industrialization, it creates world wealth imbalance. Each world region previous to this time period was producing specialized goods. When we talked about the triangular trade from 1450 to 1750, Europe produced manufactured goods. Africa had gold, ivory, and slaves. India had textiles, rugs and carpets, and also spices. Now industrialization is going to, the countries that industrialize are going to be the mass producers of finished goods. And the areas that don't industrialize are going to be only producers of raw materials. The best example is India. India, before British industrialization, before British imperialism, was the leading world producer in finished textiles. But now that the British East India Company gets in there, they make a monopoly on textile mills. They pressure their government to impose taxes on Indian textiles. The Indian producers can't compete. They sell their businesses, and now the British textile mills dominate Indian textile mills, and British mills sell all of their manufactured goods to India. The last slide of the day, we see global inequities because of industrialization. Western Europe has become the most powerful and richest area of the world. The United States, the same way. The Western powers have become very, very wealthy, and now, because they are constantly producing all of these goods, they now look to imperialism to be able to sell their goods and to have access to more raw materials. And the areas in which they take over are the areas that can't defend themselves because they are not industrialized themselves. Okay, guys, that is where we are going to end for the day. I know that was a very long lecture. I know I am tired of talking. I'm sure you're tired of listening to me talk. So, you guys, I will post this now tonight, and then I'll post the second half of this tomorrow. Talk to you.